Greetings, friends and fellow daemons, and welcome to another Daemonosophy. Today, I want to talk about Aleister Crowley, who is a very notorious figure, and whether you love him or hate him, for better for worse, he's all over out there in the occult world, all over the internet. Everyone has an idea about him. Everyone has an impression of him, and probably there is no one else you could look to as being the godfather or top influencer of what the modern occult magical world has become. His influence is just undeniable on things, regardless of what you think. So today I'm going to share with you 3 books that I think are very significant in getting a complete picture of Aleister Crowley. I'm not going to dive into any of his mystical, magical stuff, but 3 books that I think are all autobiographical or semi-autobiographical or biographical pieces, which give you an idea of where he's coming from. And let me explain where I'm coming from with this. So when I was younger and I was interested in the occult and I wanted to learn more about what magic is magic real, and these sorts of things, Aleister Crowley is one of the first things I came upon. I'm sure many people can say that. When I went to the library, I'm trying to remember if this is a school library or the city library, and this would have been in Lincoln, Nebraska, 1981 or 2 or something like that. Really, the only thing I could find was the collected works of Aleister Crowley, which was his poems. So that's one of the first things that I read. One of the second things I found was A Vision in the Voice. So basically, all of the initial stuff I read by Crowley, I couldn't make any sense out of it. This guy supposedly this really important magician, but I don't know what he's talking about. He's not even talking about anything that I could do or what, anything like that. Now that would change a little bit years later when I discovered magic in theory and practice. And that's another work on its own, which maybe I'll cover that later. But I never really got an impression of where Crowley was coming from. So the 3 books I'm going to look at are The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, the Book of the Law, with Crowley's commentary in it, the one published by him, and The Beast 666 by John Simmons. So I had read these different magical works of Aleister Crowley, but I really didn't have an idea of where he was coming from. It was all, to me, a confused and fitful presence. So things didn't start to really make sense until, for some reason, I decided to read the autohagiography, The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. And, the reason I find this book significant is because he goes into the details of his early childhood, how he first became acquainted with a magical group, like everyone in college, and where he went from there, and then his various exploits after that. But one thing that was clear in that book, and that it puts in context, is that the point in his life where he received the word thelema during the Cairo working in Egypt. He, at that point, felt that he was essentially the prophet of a new aeon for mankind. So that puts it all in perspective, that's really the central piece of Aleister Crowley that you have to, that I think is like a really significant to understand, to put him in any kind of context. And it's also really the most coherent part of Aleister Crowley. That point of having this revelation, of feeling that he had been contacted by something from beyond, something above him, and that he had been given from that a special kind of knowledge that would not only help him to transform himself, but would help others to transform and to change the face of humanity for the better. He did think that. He thought that it was going to change, that it would change things for the better. And that word thelema, which is basically a Greek word that means will, it's in the Bible somewhere. He was familiar with it, and in the King James still has the word thelema in there in some part of the Bible. I can't remember. Look it up. But it basically means will, and he paraphrased it with the word "do what thou wilt." Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, which is basically a proclamation of free will. That free will, free agency, and free markets would go along with that too, by the way. That is the basis for existence, and if everyone in the world like embraced that, then we would then the world would be a better place. Now the thing is if you go and you look at history, see, the problem is that some people don't. Some people go in and they find this Crowley thing, and then from there they look at that as like this basis of like history, and that's what like changed everything, or could have changed everything, and they don't look outside the sphere of that. But at the time that he was talking about this, the idea of free will, free agency, and free markets is something that was being talked about all over the place. It's like the tail end of like Enlightenment thinking, and you also had the Austrian economists, von Mises, and people like that were also talking about these ideas at the same time. So, I mean, Crowley would probably go back and say that all of that came from him, because he became very egomaniacal at one point. But it's also very reasonable to say that he had heard the idea of will, and obviously he read thelema in the Bible, because he had a really strict Bible upbringing and read everything. He talks about that in the Confessions. So he certainly had probably seen the word before. He also saw it somewhere. There's some, I can't remember, there's other places where people say it. There's a lot of other people that have studied the Jesus out of Crowley and will know more than me. So I'm just highlighting the pieces of it that I think are significant. So that's the first one is Confessions. The second one that I want to point out to you is the Book of the Law, the edition by Aleister Crowley. This is a hardbound edition that was given to me by a very good friend of mine in the 90s. It used to smell like kind of incensey, like OTO had like blessed it. I think that this is like the best. This is copyright 1990, Ordo Templi Orientis, and this is all printed exactly like Crowley's original version, published by the Magical Child. And so the Book of the Law is the book that he received, or claimed that he received, is dictated to him through some automatic writing through his wife at the time while they were in Egypt. He considered it a communication from a higher entity, or maybe a few higher entities, the identity of which is something for further future speculation. But the thing that I think is really significant about this edition of the Book of the Law is that it contains his foreword and it contains his introduction, where he explains all of this. He says the book was dictated in Cairo between noon and 1 p.m. on 3 successive days, April 8th, 9th, and 10th in the year 1904. The author called himself Awas and claimed to be the minister of Hur-Par-Krut, that is, a messenger from the forces ruling this earth at present, as will be explained later on. Now, Awas, that turns out to be what Crowley considered his holy guardian angel, or we would also call the daemon, or his higher self, his higher awareness. And that was the minister of Hur-Par-Krut, and Hur-Par-Krut is later determined to be Harpocrates, or Horus, the Egyptian god Horus, which is also by Setians considered a face of Set, and other sources also. There's a duality of Set Horus in Egyptian mythology. And then as he maps out in the next step, democracy daughters, ferocious fascism, cackling communism, equally frauds, cavort crazily all over the globe. They're hemming us in. They're abortive births of the child, the new aeon of Horus. Liberty stirs once more in the womb of time. So he says liberty stir. He specifically uses the word liberty. Isn't that funny? You see so many left-wing OTO people out there cracking on liberty and libertarianism nowadays. Are they aware that this is what the prophet said? His critique of democracy and fascism and communism, the way he says these are all the same thing. These are all forms of statism. That could be Ludwig von Mises speaking. They're hemming us in. He wrote this when did he write this? And then he discusses the law of Thelema. He says, this book lays down a simple code of conduct. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. This means that each of us stars is to move on our own true orbit, as marked out by the nature of our position, the law of our growth, the impulse of our past experiences. All events are equally lawful, and everyone necessary in the long run for all of us in theory. But in practice, only one act is lawful for each one of us at any given moment. Therefore, duty consists in determining to experience the right event from one moment of consciousness to another. So, one thing that Crowley lacked, 1938. He wrote that in fucking 1938, and it sounds like it could be about today, right now. This is why Crowley should be a wake-up call to liberate yourself from the shackles and bondage of statism. Why are there so many people out there who are into Crowley and fancy themselves diehard Crowleyites? They don't get that. Why is there all these people who are such Crowley fanatics and Crowley followers who are like, oh no, you better follow that mask mandate, you better get vaccinated? You know, you better like do what the government says. I just don't get it. Crowley clearly says all of that is bullshit, and the law of Thelema is about awakening to your own pure, true, individual nature. He continues, evolution makes its changes by anti-socialistic ways. The abnormal man who foresees the trend of the times and adapts circumstance intelligently is laughed at, persecuted, often destroyed by the herd. But he and his heirs, when the crisis comes, are survivors. So he's saying, stick to your own. Stick to your own inner truth. And don't worry about the names that they call you, for you will win in the end. Above us today hangs a danger never yet unparalleled in history. That's 1938 again. We suppress the individual in more and more ways. We think in terms of the herd. I mean, what would you think today? We suppress the individual in more and more ways. What would he think today about COVID lockdowns? Inconceivable. Inconceivable. What would he think about what about the taxation? I mean, it's got to be astronomically higher. I can go back and look up from 1938 to now, but it's just got to be just ridiculously higher. What would he think of the European Union? He says, war no longer kills soldiers. It kills all indiscriminately. So, I mean, this could be because he was seeing some of the first, it was really World War II that really started the killing of civilians. During the Enlightenment era, warfare had like moved towards the gentleman's warfare, and there was like a moral ethic about not like killing civilians. But from World War I to World War II, killing of civilians became a thing. And he's noting that in here, how that's worse and worse. And it's only worse it's even worse today. I mean, I could go back and talk about, and I have before in my various communications, about the civilian death numbers in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Dresden, Hiroshima are some really good examples of civilians being destroyed as used as military targets during modern warfare. And the whole Middle Eastern conflict and during the 20 years of the Bush era. It's shameful. What would he think now? He says every new measure of the most democratic and autocratic governments is communistic in essence. So it is always restriction. We are all treated as imbecile children. So that's a reference to, nowadays we'd say, the nanny state, as we're all treated as imbecile children. The state wants to basically take care of everything for you. And that they're all communistic in essence. Many have noted before that World War II and the conflict of the three great the superpowers it basically Soviet, English Russian Soviet, English socialism, and American FDR socialism all came together to defeat another brand of socialism, which is fascism and nationalism under Japan, Italy, and Germany. It's all war of the socialisms. I mean, that's why he says it's all communistic in essence. It's all the same bullshit. He's saying you're not supposed to pick a side in this. There are no good guys in this. You're supposed to just pick yourself. That's what the law of Thelema says. It says pick yourself and stand with yourself. Fascism is like communism and dishonest into the bargain. The dictators suppress all art, literature, theater, music, news, that which does not meet their requirements. Yet the world only moves by the light of genius. The herd will be destroyed in mass. So again, what would he think about lockdowns? I mean, it's all of this times 10. And when he says the world only moves by the light of genius, I mean, this is the same thing that Ayn Rand said, that we see the really evolution of humanity, of social evolution, only takes place by the action of entrepreneurs. It's never by the decision of some government board or bureaucracy or some army or some politician. They never leads to evolution, but they churn out propaganda, which makes it look like it does. The establishment of the law of Thelema is the only way to preserve individual liberty and to assure the future of the race. In the words of the famous paradox of the Comte de Finis, the absolute rule of the state shall be a function of the absolute liberty of each individual will. All men and women are invited to cooperate with the Master Therian in this, the great work. And he uses that word cooperation, you know. Whenever, and I pointed this out I don't know how many times, whenever you criticize collectivism, people always like come back, well, no man's not an island. You're not alone. You have to work with other people to do that. Well, no, I know people work together. We call that cooperation. Voluntary, willful cooperation. That is different from collectivism, which always implies coercion, force, obligation. Okay? There's a difference. It doesn't mean, the law of Thelema and individualism doesn't mean, oh, you shut yourself off from everyone and you never talk to anyone ever again. You say, no, it's ridiculous. Capitalism as a free market system relies on interaction. If you don't go out and invest your money in something, then your money deflates and you lose it. You have to go out and participate in the free market. You have to contribute value in order to receive payment for the things that you do. So it's so ironic. Capitalism really means cooperation and interaction from people, but on a voluntary basis. Somehow, this is again and again cast as being the ultimate evil and the ultimate boogeyman. But Aleister Crowley, in his Book of the Law, sweeps away all of that bullshit and nonsense. So when people talk collectivism to you, out of one side of their mouth, while they're also like preaching the virtues of Thelema out the other side of the mouth, call bullshit on them. Okay, so after puffing up Crowley on all of that, and so again, to go back for like the context of it, so this is what I consider he was at his height, right? Like this is like 1938. I mean, this was at his most lucid and most sincere and most on top of it. And the other things going on in his life, I think, indicate that as well, which I invite you to research on your own. So here's the third one I'm going to talk about. This is The Great Beast 666 by John Simmons. So the tragedy with Aleister Crowley, this is what I was going to say earlier, is that in all of his talk about individuality and all of his refutation of statism, he never really fully put his finger on or articulated the importance of economics, the importance of free markets and capitalism, the place of free markets and capitalism in individualism. as the extension. That's the actual extension into society and a social system. So whenever he would go from like talking about the individual to talking about the social system, his system would kind of break down, and he'd just talk about, you know, he'd get into like magic and stuff like that. So I don't know if it's because he didn't really understand any of that, or if because there were other economic thinkers and stuff out there like von Mises and the other Austrian economists, and other economists on that are talking about there's like other French and a lot of French ones. I should know their names. I regrettably don't, but a lot of other people were talking about economic theories like this at the time. I mean, free market, laissez-faire, the concept of laissez-faire, invented by the French, which means leave us alone. And this is where we get the term laissez-faire capitalism, was very much around in his time. So my point is, I don't know if he didn't know about these things or if he's avoiding talking about them because he doesn't want to sound influenced by him, because he suffers from that same prophet magus complex where he has to make everything seem like he came up with all of it. Okay? And if you study Anton LaVey, it's the same thing. It's like he says all these great things, but when he gets to a certain point, you know, like when he gets to the point of Ayn Rand, he starts arbitrarily changing things to make it look like he's not into this or that, like he didn't get his ideas, like it all just like came to him like magically. And that's too bad, because that allows other people who follow him to also make that same cutoff in their life. And by making that cutoff, by not rationally looking at how these ideas translate into the material universe around you, you leave a space where these evil external statist collectivist influences can come in and start answering those questions for you with propaganda. So again, this was his high point, but then he was like, since he didn't go that extra effort, there's a big blank space there, which I think gets filled in with bullshit. And the other problem was that he was a total drug addict. And that's where Simmons' book comes in. So another way in which he failed to enact his principles in the economic realm is the fact that he never had any money. He had a fortune which he squandered, and this is very well documented in Confessions and other sources, as well as this book. And at the end of his, and the reason is because he was a drug addict. So a lot of people try and like excuse his drugism or normalize it or minimize it and say that he just did it a little bit for inspiration. I think Robert Anton Wilson is really guilty of it. As much as I love Raw, he's really guilty of this too. That, he just did drugs like consciously. He did them magically and it helped inspire him and stuff like that. Well, it also destroyed him. It destroyed him physically and it destroyed him financially. And also, like it does with everyone, being dependent on all of that shit puts you in touch with bad people, bad influences that take advantage of you and eventually destroy you. So it's all very, so at the end of his life, he had no money, was living in a poor house. And this guy, John Simmons, just came to visit him with another friend. He didn't like Aleister Crowley. He thought he was a loser and a drug addict and a weirdo and a whack job. No interest in him whatsoever, but he was kind to him for a few minutes in the poorhouse, and Crowley decided based on that to will all of his works to him. And as a result of that, Simmons got all of his biography, all of his like notes and his and you know, that's why you see his name on all these other things. Crowley willed all of his shit to this guy. And so then there's all these legal battles with the OTO and stuff like that. And I'm not going to get into that right now. But Crowley also he was a journaler, and he wrote in his journal every day. And what he wrote about in his journal every day was about his drug use. Every day he documented how much drugs he did. He documented how addicted he was, how he's trying to like fucking, like minimize it or stretch it out. I only got so many drugs for today, so I'm gonna just do a little bit now, a little bit. And it's all heroin. It's all heroin and cocaine, mostly heroin. So make no delusions about that. And because of that, because he went that route, at the end of his life, he lacked any kind of power or autonomy over where he was going to live, what he was going to do, or what was going to happen with his writings. So he gave them to this guy. If this guy hadn't started writing about it, I mean, that probably would have been it, So he publishes in this book a lot of Crowley's diaries. Let's see if I can find some of this. Other highlights in the book: Karl Roos was a Marxist. Crowley's attitude and promiscuity churns up chaotic forces. Public interest 40 years after his death, especially in popular circles. Crowley visits Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff calls him, "You filthy man, all dirty inside. You never come here again." Oh yeah, children had to watch sex orgies at the Abbey of Thelema. So, yeah, today he would be dismissed as a pedophile by one faction and alt-right by another faction. Crowley calls Hadith, the entity Hadith in the book of Coming Forth by Night, Crowley called Hadith Set. Crowley acknowledges that. He says that "do what thou wilt" most definitely has something to do with anarchism. Thelema is a third way between Bolshevism and industrial capitalism. So my purpose here is not to destroy the image of Aleister Crowley, but really to point out the kernel of truth in there, the gold inside of the lead, the diamond in the rough, as it were, while at the same time acknowledging the shortcomings. Like they say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but keep the baby. Don't keep the bathwater. Crowley's failure to implement his own law in certain ways was his own undoing. Now, some like to say that there's a magical reason for this because it's the nature of Horus. Maybe there's some truth to that. Or maybe it's just because he was a drug addict. I mean, drug addiction makes people do stupid things. It makes them do bad things. It makes them do sad things. And they lose themselves in it all the time, creating justifications and buffers for it. So this is why it's so important to look within the self and not get pushed along by other people. This is something Anton LaVey said: never take advice from someone who has less than you. Crowley probably had less than you. And a lot of the people out there pushing Aleister Crowley probably have less than you as well. So know when to, take what you will from it and leave the rest there. And remember that it's ultimately up to you to disconnect from the deleterious influences that approach you in life. And so, with such love and fervor for the true will of Thelema that burns in the soul of man, I bid you all keep the dark fires burning.